Part 3. Doomed Lords Passing. Quoting the Chronicle of the Black Sword. For the mind of man alone is free to explore the lofty vastness of the cosmic infinite, to transcend ordinary consciousness, or roam the subterranean corridors of the human brain with its boundless dimensions. And universe and individual are linked, the one mirrored in the other, and each contains the other. The dreaming city no longer dreamed in splendour. The tattered towers of Imrir were blackened husks, tumbled rags of masonry standing sharp and dark against a sullen sky. Once Elric's vengeance had brought fire to the city, and the fire had brought ruin. Streaks of cloud like sooty smoke whispered across the pulsing sun, so that the shouting, red-stained waters beyond Imrir were soiled by shadow. And they seemed to become quieter, as if hushed by the black scars that rode across their ominous turbulence. Upon a confusion of fallen masonry, a man stood watching the waves. A tall man, broad-shouldered, slender at hip, a man with slanting brows, pointed, lobeless ears, high cheekbones, and crimson, moody eyes in a dead-white, ascetic face. He was dressed in black, quilted doublet and heavy cloak, both high-collared, emphasizing the pallor of his albino skin. The wind, erratic and warm, played with his cloak, fingered it, and passed mindlessly on to howl through the broken towers. Elric heard the howling, and his memory was filled by the sweet, the malicious and melancholy melodies of old Melniboné. He remembered too the other music his ancestors had created, when they had elegantly tortured their slaves, choosing them for the pitch of their screams and forming them into instruments of unholy symphonies. Lost in this nostalgia for a while, he found something close to forgetfulness, and he wished that he had never doubted the code of Melniboné, wished that he had accepted it without question, and thus left his mind unsundered. Bitterly he smiled. Another figure appeared below him and climbed the tumbled stones to stand by his side. He was a small, red-haired man, with a wide mouth and eyes that had once been bright and amused. "You look to the east, Elric," Moonglum murmured. He looked back towards something irremediable. Elric put his long-fingered hand on his friend's shoulder. "Where else is there to look, Moonglum, when the world lies beneath the heel of chaos? What would you have me do? Look forward to days of hope and laughter, to an old age lived in peace with children around my feet?" He laughed softly. It was not a laugh that Moonglum liked to hear. "Separates spoke of help from the White Lords. It must come soon. We must wait patiently." Moonglum turned to squint into the glowering and motionless sun, and then his face set in an introspective look, cast his eyes down to the rubble on which he stood. Elric was silent for a moment, watching the waves. Then he shrugged. "Why complain? Does me no good. I cannot act on my own volition. Whatever fate is before me cannot be changed. I pray that the men who follow us will make use of their ability to control their own destinies. I have no such ability." He touched his jawbone with his fingers, and then looked at the hand, noting nails, knuckles, muscles, and veins standing out on the pale skin. He ran his hand through the silky strands of his white hair, drew a long breath and let it out in a sigh. Logic. The world cries for logic. I have none. Yet here I am, formed as a man with mind, heart, and vitals. Yet formed by a chance coming together of certain elements. The world needs logic. Yet all the logic in the world is worth as much as one lucky guess. Men take pains to weave a web of careful thoughts, yet others thoughtlessly weave a random pattern and achieve the same result. So much for the thoughts of the sage. Ah, Moonglum winked with attempted levity. Thus speaks the wild adventurer, the cynic. But we are not all wild and cynical, Elric. Other men tread other paths, and reach other conclusions than yours. I tread one that's preordained. Come, let's to the dragon caves and see what Divum Slorm has done to rouse our reptilian friends. They stumbled together down the ruins and walked the shattered canyons that had once been the lovely streets of Imria, out of the city and along a grassy track that wound through the gorse, disturbing a flock of large ravens that fled into the air, cawing, all save one, the king, who balanced himself on a bush, his cloak of ruffled feathers drawn up in dignity, his black eyes regarding them with weary contempt. Down through the sharp rocks to the gaping entrance of the dragon caves, down the steep steps into torchlit darkness with its damp warmth and smell of scaly reptilian bodies, into the first cave where the great recumbent forms of the sleeping dragons lay, their folded leathery wings rising into the shadows, their green and black scales glowing faintly, their clawed feet folded and their slender snouts curled back, even in sleep, to display the long ivory teeth that seemed like so many white stalactites. Their dilating red nostrils groaned in torpid slumber. The smell of their hides and their breath was unmistakable, rousing in Moonglum some memory inherited from his ancestors, some shadowy impression of a time when these dragons and their masters swept across a world they ruled, their inflammable venom dripping from the fangs and heedlessly setting fire to the countryside across which they flew. Elric, used to it, hardly noticed the smell, but passed on through the first cave and the second until he found Divum Slorm, striding about with a torch in one hand and a scroll in the other, swearing to himself. He looked up as he heard their booted feet approach. He spread out his arms and shouted, his voice echoing through the caves. Nothing. Not a stir. Not an eyelid flickering. There's no way of rousing them. They'll not wake until they have slept their necessary number of years. And that we had not used them on the last two occasions, for we have greater need of them today. Neither you nor I had the knowledge we have now. Regret is useless, since it can achieve nothing. Elric stared around him at the huge shadowy forms. Here, slightly apart from the rest, lay the leader dragon, one he recognised and felt affection for. Flame Fang, the eldest, who was 5,000 years old and still young for a dragon. But Flame Fang, like the rest, slept on. He went up to the beast and stroked its metal-like scales, ran his hand down the ivory smoothness of its great front fangs, felt its warm breath on his body and smiled. Beside him on his hip he heard Stormbringer murmur. He patted the blade. Here's one soul you cannot have. The dragons are indestructible. They will survive even though all the world collapses into nothing. Divum Slorm said from another part of the cavern, I can't think of a further action to take for the meantime, Elric. Let's go back to the Tower of De Rumpunta and refresh ourselves. Elric nodded assent, and together the three men returned through the caves and ascended the steps into the sunlight. So, Divum Slorm remarked, Still no nightfall. The sun has remained in that position for 13 days, ever since we left the camp of chaos and made our perilous way to Melniboné. How much power must chaos wield if it can stop the sun in its course? Chaos might not have done this for all we know, Moonglum pointed out, though it's likely, of course, that it did. Time has stopped. Time waits. But waits for what? More confusion? Further disorder? Or the influence of the great balance which will restore order and take vengeance against those forces that have gone against its will? Or does time wait for us, 3 mortal men adrift, cut off from what is happening to all other men, waiting on time as it waits on us? Perhaps the sun waits on us, Elric agreed, for is it not our destiny to prepare the world for its fresh course? It makes me feel a little more than a mere pawn if that's the case. What if we do nothing? Will the sun remain where it is forever? They paused in their progress for a moment and stood staring up at the pulsating red disk which flooded the streets with scarlet light, at the black clouds which fled across the sky before it. Where were the clouds going? Where did they come from? They seemed instilled with purpose. It was possible that they were not even clouds at all, but spirits of chaos bent on dark errands. Elric grunted to himself, aware of the uselessness of such speculation. He led the way back to the tower of De Arputna, where years before he had sought his love, his cousin Cimmeril, and later lost her to the ravening thirst of the blade by his side. The tower had survived the flames, though the colours that had once adorned it were blackened by fire. Here he left his friends and went on to his own room to fling himself, fully clad, upon the soft Melnibonéan bed. Almost immediately, fell asleep.